have a guess. The zeppelin is the
And all these airplanes were part of the presentation.
Okay. So
The
not
Zeppelin,
the
the Maddox Airlines, that's part of Maddox Airlines.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
You want to go ahead and
I'll
start?
start. Yeah.
You know what, because this is one of our firsts, that we've had so many people come for our meetings. I mean, if we have 10, that's a lot, so good job.
Okay, I'll tell you where it's at. It's the Bullocks Wilshire.
Oh,
my gosh.
The foyer when the stars would come in their big cars and get out to do their clothes shopping. It was the ceiling above where the carport is though. So that's this image here is from Bullocks Wilshire. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's an Art Deco masterpiece. My wife's a board member of the Art Deco Society of Los Angeles, so we've been there several times, but it's an Art Deco masterpiece. And Southwestern Law School has taken over the property, and it's maintained beautifully. Yeah. So, some of your parents might have shopped there at one time, or grandparents. So I grew up in the house that my parents built in 1948 on Richmond Street. 515 Richmond, a half a block from here. And I, like many other families in El Segundo, my dad worked in aerospace. He retired from Aerospace Corporation. He had also worked with Northrop and Horky Moore and Pneumo Dynamics and all these other little companies. He was a controller. But, you know, I was inspired to do this because so many of our friends and families ourselves have worked in aerospace. So raise your hand if you've worked in aerospace. So a lot of this room. And then, do you have family or friends that have worked in aerospace? Of course. So it's very much an integral part of the South Bay employment. And it grew because the weather was good out here. That benefited aviation development, and the movie production kind of came along about the same time. You know, so I'm going back to the early 1900s now, okay? And, but early aviation was popular and exciting, but you're gonna see here that it was very experimental and dangerous at the very beginning where I start. And this presentation is to show how we got to where we're at now. So there were the two premier pioneers were Glenn Martin and the Loghead brothers, which became Lockheed. Okay, and then three men worked for them who also became major parts of aircraft manufacturing. Donald Douglas, Jack Northrop, and Dutch Kindleberger. Does that sound familiar to anybody from North American Aviation? North American Aviation became Rockwell International, now it's part of Boeing. And there were a lot of different early events through the decades that kind of influenced the local growth of our aerospace industry as we see it now. And these early legacy companies that I'm going to show you that started out in the early 1900s, they've now grown to be the largest aerospace companies in the world, and we're still the largest concentration of aerospace jobs in the world. Yeah, but it started back in the early 1900s. So the first kind of key event that started aviation in Southern California was the 1910 International Air Show that was done over where Cal State Dominguez Hills is. And it was the first major air show in the USA. This is, 7 years after the Wright brothers. Glenn Curtiss was the first person to fly an airplane in the Western US. That happened at that show. And at the time, there were about 500,000 people living in LA, but about half of that 500,000 came to the air show. I mean, they had heard about it, they heard about planes, they read about planes in newspapers, but this was the first opportunity for people to see an airplane. And this is the kind of stuff that was being flown at the air show. Different types of airplanes, balloons. And then after the air show, soon after the air show, a motor drome was built over in Playa del Rey in the wetlands. And that was in 1910, just a few months after the air show. And it was a 1 mile circular track. There were many speed records that were accomplished there. And they also built a hangar inside the motor drome to attract aviation activity. So there's the hangar that was inside the motor drome. It was sponsored by the Aero Club of California, and it was an experimental center for aviation inventors to work out their ideas. This was all still very experimental. And they could house 16 airplanes in there. There was a machine shop. They talked about having a flight school, aircraft manufacturing nearby. But neither the motor drome or the aerofield really ever gained a lot of momentum in that location. And the fire destroyed the motor drome in 1913 and didn't get rebuilt. But there's some pictures of planes and the motor drome. You can see the outline of the motor drome in some of these photos. And this is a young woman who was a star at the time, Mabel Normand. And she was in a Max Sennett Keystone comedy called, slapstick comedy called Dash Through the Clouds. And part of it was filmed over at the motor drome. It was the first theater movie with an airplane flying. She was 19 years old. It was the first woman to fly in a movie. She later took flying lessons, and she had friends with many early aviators. So there's the motor drome in the back behind her. And I'm not exactly sure what the plot of this little song is. I found the clip for the flying. But she gets in there with this guy, Philip Parmley, and that's what it used to be to take off in a plane back in 1912. Some pretty rudimentary flight controls. He's standing out there in the wetlands. Why don't you learn to fly? There's the motor drome. So they're landing just outside the motor drome. They're not landing inside it. But the motor drome was a mile square, so it was or mile circle, so it was a good sized area. Anyway. All very exciting. These guys that were building airplanes, there wasn't a market for them. I mean, there weren't airlines. The military wasn't really using planes. So they got into, to make money and to kind of promote aviation, they got into what was called barnstorming. So this is a clip of two famous people, Lincoln Beechey, who was one of the most esteemed pilots at the time, and Barney Oldfield driving, and they would race each other around a track in front of a grandstand. So there's the plane taking off. And here's Barney Oldfield coming around the track. It's pretty close to the grandstand there, right? And then here comes the plane dropping in to race with him. So I don't think they would do that. It's very exciting to sit in those grandstands and have a planes fly by you and cars racing by. There he is coming in again. Okay, so this is kind of a story to itself, a lot of reading here. I'm not going to go through it. But in white are all, there's about, let's see, there's 6 pilots there that all died young after just a few years of flying, and all within a few years of each other. The guy that was in the first clip we watched, the pilot near the motordrome, he died a couple of months after that was filmed. Lincoln Beachy, who you just saw flying around the grandstand, he died in 1915 in an airplane crash. And these are all like friends of Mabel Norman. That's her sitting there. And after having 6 close friends die in flying accidents, she said, "I feel afraid, but the fascination of flying still possesses me." So it was exciting. So the first major personality is a guy named Glenn Luther Martin. Now you know Martin, Grumman Martin Aviation. And he was born in Iowa. He came to Santa Ana in 1907. In 1910, he built his own airplane after the Dominguez meet. And in 1911, he was the first person in the USA to get an international pilot's license. So there he is building his Curtiss airplane design in Santa Ana. There it is sitting in it. All the tubes and wires, and looks pretty flimsy to me. Then in 1912, Van Griffith donated 100 acres to do something to further aviation up at Griffith Park, and that became a Griffith Park Aerodrome. And Martin started the world's largest airplane factory there and flying school at Griffith Park. And one of his early test pilots was a Blanche Tomboy of the Air Scott. First woman to solo an airplane, first woman to fly long distance, 60 miles in New York. She flew prototypes for Glenn Martin. She was known for flying upside down and performing death dives. So she was exciting. This is one of Glenn Martin's first hydro airplanes, so it could take off from water, take off and land on water. And 10 May 1912, he flew from Newport Bay to Catalina, and he broke the English Channel record for over water flight. So that was a big feat in 1912 to fly that distance. He was also looking for a market, so he actually provided an air-to-sea bomber to some Mexican insurgents. They wanted to attack the Mexican Navy in the port of Guaymas, and he put 2 seats in there, one for a bomber, and they had some 3-inch pipe bombs to drop on the Mexican Navy. It was the first known air-to-naval bombing runs in history. That was back in 1913. So, here's another one of Glenn Martin's employees, Tiny Broadway. She, at 15 years old, she started jumping from hot air balloons. I don't know how many parents would let their 15-year-old do that nowadays, but at 20 years old, she was the first woman to parachute from a plane, and she was also the first person to parachute from a seaplane into the water, and that's Glenn Martin above her there where she's sitting. He's flying one of his airplanes, and that's how she would sit. That was her seat to go up in the plane. Here she is giving a parachute demo to the U.S. Army. She invented the parachute ripcord. So, yeah. And here's Glenn Martin's fighter plane that went down to Texas. It was involved in the Civil War in Mexico, which involved Pancho Villa. And this was the first American military aircraft to be fired on by a hostile force. So they were firing a machine gun at it from the Mexican side of the border down in Mexico. That's a Glenn Martin fighter plane. This movie is lost. It was called Girl of Yesterday. And so Glenn Martin was asked to fly Mary Pickford, who was one of the highest paid screen actresses of the time to fly her in this movie. And at first he was reluctant because they told him he'd have to kiss a girl, and he said, "My mother wouldn't like it." So he never did marry. He lived with his mother until her death, so I think he's the proverbial mama's boy, even though he's very adventurous. Here's another hydroplane that he made in 1915. Now this I want to start tying the loose ends together. So this plane was designed by Donald Douglas, who became Douglas Aircraft. And a gentleman, Oscar Brindley, flew it and set a record. He flew for 554 miles in 10 hours. So that's 55 miles an hour. He set 3 world altitude records in this plane, and it was a long-standing record, at least for a few years. Here's another way that they were trying to promote airplanes. This is using an airplane to transport a motorcycle. And when you're landing, you always need like a couple guys to run along to make sure the wings don't hit the ground. And then you have a crew there to get the bike off as quick as you can. You know, I'm sure they were trying to sell this concept to the military, you know, that you could carry a motorcycle and deliver a message on the battlefield. And here he comes back after deliver the message, load it up, hop in, and take off. Escape out of there. But in 1915, Boeing came down and was one of the, William Boeing, a Boeing aircraft came down. He was one of Glenn Martin's student pilots, and he bought a hydroplane and shipped it to Seattle. That was his first plane up there. And then in 1916, Glenn Martin merged with 4 companies to become Wright-Martin Aircraft Corporation. In 1917, Glenn Martin left Wright-Martin, and he formed Glenn L. Martin in Cleveland, Ohio. And in 1918, the Wright-Martin factory at Griffith Park was closed. But Glenn Martin moved to Cleveland. And then when he was in Cleveland, Donald Douglas of Douglas Aircraft designed America's first bomber. He later on started Douglas Aircraft in 1921. And then another person, James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, who I'm going to talk about later, he was a draftsman, and he designed the second bomber, the MB-2. And later on, Glenn Martin moved from Cleveland to Baltimore, and he built mainly bombers up there. So now the other premier names in early pioneering of aviation are the Loghead brothers, which eventually became Lockheed, Alan and Malcolm. So they built their first airplane up in San Francisco, and they flew sightseers in the San Francisco Bay from like 1912 to 1915. There's their Model G that they did the sightseeing in. And then in 1918, they set up Lockheed Aircraft Manufacturing in Santa Barbara, and they came up with a flying boat called the F-1 to carry 10 passengers. And up there, 20-year-old Jack Northrop was assisting the Loghead brothers. So Jack Northrop of Northrop Corporation started his career with the Loghead brothers. And this plane set speed and distance records. It was a good plane, but there was no market. The World War I was ending in 1918, and there was no interest in purchasing this plane from the Loghead brothers. There it is there. And here it is with wheels. Just kind of note is that in World War I, of all the fighter planes flown by US pilots in World War I, they were all European made. There was no US made fighter planes in World War I. And mainly the US was flying French planes. And Great Britain, France, and Germany dominated World War I aircraft manufacturing. So in 1919, when young Jack Northrop was with Lockheed, the Lockheed brothers, he designed this plane called the S-1 sport plane. So you can see in just, 8 years how much had progressed in the design, getting more streamlined, more aerodynamic. This is a 2-seat plane for recreational flying, but none were sold because all these surplus Jennies that were flown over in Europe were coming back home, and they were war surplus, so there was no market for a more expensive plane. And in 1920, loghead aircraft manufacturing ceased to exist. So this was the first airline in California. It was started by Sid Chaplin, the half-brother of Charlie Chaplin. It's a little plane called a Curtiss Seagull flying boat. It flew from San Pedro to Catalina Island. That was the first airline in California, the second in the USA. And also about the same time, Donald Douglas, who had gone and started Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, in 1924, he built these world cruisers, and they took 175 days to circumnavigate the globe. And that was the first round-the-world flight. Only 2 of the 4 aircraft that started completed the flight. But that was a big deal for an airplane to accomplish an around-the-world flight. And then in 1926, Lockheed Aircraft, not Loghead anymore, they dropped Loghead and it became Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, was formed in Hollywood. And a plane called the Vega was designed by Northrop and Gerald Volti, and they would both have their own companies. It was a 4 to 7-seat aircraft. It was made in molds with plywood and glue. About 132 were built. And it was the first aircraft with a streamlined design around the engine cowl. So there's the first Vega. It doesn't have the engine cowl, but that's what the first Vega looked like up in Hollywood. And the Vega production was moved to Burbank, and Jack Northrop left Lockheed. And then the Vega did the first nonstop transcontinental flight and speed record across the US. It did the first Arctic crossing in an airplane and later did Antarctic explorations. And then in 1929, Alan Loghead, the original Loghead brothers, he sold his stock. In 1929, the Vega won every speed award at the Cleveland Air Races. And in 1932, Lockheed was bought by investors. So this is Amelia Earhart. She had a Vega 5B called the Little Red Bus. That was the first airplane with the streamlined cowling around the engine. And she did a solo Atlantic crossing and nonstop across the USA. Both first were women and both in Vegas designed by Jack Northrop. So then now we're gonna start getting a little more local. The first airline, let's just say this, Maddox Airlines started 22 September 1927, and their office was downtown LA in this Art Deco building, and they were the first airline at what was going to become Mines Field, LAX. So there you can see their planes, their Ford tri-motor planes lined up looking to the north, and the buildings in the background that's basically Wilshire Boulevard, where I said the Bullocks Wilshire was, that original picture. And there's LA City Hall sitting there prominently as the tallest building in Los Angeles. Their inaugural flight was San Diego to Mines Field. They could carry 12 passengers in these Ford tri-motors. And then a few years later, Maddox Airlines became part of TWA Airlines. So let's see if this is going to work. think that's Mount Wilson Observatory.
What observatory was that?
So it was pretty wide open in LA even then. They're just looking out towards us. There's LA City Hall. And in 1928, they had national air races at what was to becomes Mines Field. So that's Century on the bottom. You're looking kind of towards the northeast. All that diagonal line that you see there are cars parked to watch the air races. Yeah, that's their parking lot, all those diagonal lines. And then the down where it says Century, that's where the flying was taking place. So it was a very popular event to have an air race. Okay, so now, how many have ever heard of Moreland Aircraft? No. Okay, so Moreland Aircraft, in 1927, this guy, George Elmer Moreland, he got interested in aviation, and he took flights with investors on Maddox Airlines. And in October of 1928, Mines Field was dedicated. That was east of Sepulveda, near Imperial, kind of like Imperial Nash. But in March of 1929, Moreland broke ground on the first aircraft manufacturing plant in the South Bay. It was across from Mines Field. He had ambitious plans, but only 4 of these aircraft were built. That was his factory, so that's what Imperial Highway used to look like. That's kind of down here. That's kind of down near Imperial and Nash. Okay.
Where's the 105?
Yeah, the 105 is over here. Yeah, so it's up here. And yeah, so that's Moreland Aircraft, and it had a long history. Not as Moreland, but as others. And that was hangar number 1, which is still there at LAX. Yeah, the hangar number 1 is still there. So that would be looking north across from the Moreland Aircraft Factory across Imperial Highway. This is what you'd be looking at. Some sheep grazing where there's now all the cargo buildings there along Imperial. But yeah, that's a National Historic Register building, and it's still being used as, I think it's DHL might own it, or one of them is still using it for cargo. So that's kind of a bird's eye view. The air races were up there above Mines Field. Hangar number 1 is where it says Mines Field. The Moreland Aircraft Building is south of Imperial Highway, out there near Aviation Boulevard. That's kind of where it all got started around here. And then I'm going to segue into Zeppelin travel, because there was something interesting that happened. But Zeppelin travel was happened from like 1928 to 1937. And the 2 main Zeppelins were the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg, which was, the Hindenburg was the largest aircraft ever. It was huge. But they did transatlantic flights from Germany to the Americas. It took about 3 days at 80 miles an hour, but that was twice as fast as your ocean liners. So if you were a wealthy person and you could might pay for that ticket, you could get there in half the time of going on one of those fancy ocean liners. But there it is in perspective. There's a Zeppelin with a 747 underneath it and an ocean liner below it. So, and then they had to figure out where are they going to land these Zeppelins. So they had this idea that they would use moorings on top of tall buildings like the Empire State Building and Los Angeles City Hall. So if you ever take a tour of Los Angeles City Hall, that 27th floor was, possibly going to be a Zeppelin air terminal. And you ask yourself, well, how do they do that? There's the passenger loading area. All right, you get the idea now, how to get on a zeppelin? So, the Graf Zeppelin made a round the world flight, and it landed over here at Mines Field in 1929 at 5 a.m. in the morning. And so there it is looking west with Aviation, next to it. And on the bottom right is it looking towards the west, and down there where it says Imperial is where hangar number 1 is. And it was a 79-hour flight from Tokyo. 100,000 people came to Mines Field to see the Zeppelin. So you can see kind of the outline of cars along Aviation and down there, which would be kind of like Century, to see a Zeppelin. Maddox Airlines earlier, they escorted the Graf Zeppelin into its landing, but they had an inversion layer and it made the landing very difficult. They couldn't land it, so they released a bunch of their hydrogen to get it on the ground. Okay, and then the next day, when they went to take off, it was 19 hours on the ground. There wasn't any hydrogen in Los Angeles to replenish what they had offloaded. So they tried to lighten it as much as possible. They took out furniture, fuel and water. They sent 6 crewmen ahead to Lakehurst, New Jersey, which was going to be its next stop. And they thought they got it light enough. But when they started taking off, the tail was dragging on the ground, and they couldn't get airborne, and they were heading towards power lines. And so I guess they just barely, from what I've read, they just barely got the tail up and cleared the power lines, or we could have had a Hindenburg type disaster here. And then that's what happened in 1937 with the Hindenburg. But it was the fastest round the world flight ever. Took 21 days. It had departed from Lakehurst, and you got to, in perspective, you didn't start commercial airline service for another 10 years. So this is kind of the way it was back then. So now we'll go into who's could arguably be said the greatest aerospace aviation engineer ever was Jack Northrop. He was a visionary beyond all others. He grew up in Santa Barbara, rehashing. He worked for Lockheed Brothers. He worked with Donald Douglas on the world cruisers that went around the world. And he also was the one that designed the Vega that set all sorts of records that Amelia Earhart flew. So he was quite the man. And in 1928, he started his own company called Aviation Corporation up in Burbank. And in 1928, he already had this flying wing vision for airplanes. And he built a plane called the Alpha that was Vega airplane influenced. And it was flown by TWA. I'm going to skip some of these so we can keep on track. Then he also, then in 1932, he moved he's formed Northrop Corporation as a subsidiary of Douglas Aircraft, and he moved into the old Moreland factory, the one that was on Imperial Highway. So he left Burbank, came to El Segundo, moved into Moreland, and he designed this plane called the Gamma. And it was a 3-passenger, 1,200-mile range, 165 miles an hour. It was used by the Chinese against Japan, and it set speed records, and it did Antarctic exploration. So that was designed and built here in El Segundo at the old Moreland factory. He also designed an aircraft called the Delta. It was used primarily for survey and coast patrol. And then how many here have ever heard of the Pickwick factory? There was a bus factory. So Douglas Aircraft purchased the old Pickwick night coach factory that had been in operation from 1929 to 32. And they used to make these sleeper style coaches, and they ran buses across the country, and were kind of a precursor or genesis of like the Greyhound bus lines. That's what traveling by bus would have looked like. Didn't want to take a train. But Northrop moved into that facility, and at that facility he designed and built these A-17 attack bombers. They were used as trainers and squadron support aircraft, and sold overseas to sold about 20 of them overseas. And then he also built a BT bomber from 1935 to 38. It was going to be a carrier-based aircraft, but it didn't work out. But this design became the beginning of what later on will be called the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber that I'll talk about later on. And so Northrop Aircraft Corporation became Northrop Corporation. In 1937, there was labor difficulties, and so Northrop Aircraft Corporation was dissolved by Douglas. Donald Douglas said, okay, we're not going to be involved with Jack Northrop anymore. So that Moreland plant became the El Segundo division of Douglas Aircraft. And Northrop Corporation moved over to Hawthorne, where Hawthorne Airport is, and where Tesla and SpaceX is now. And in the Warriors, they built a plane over there called the P-61 Black Widow night fighter. 706 were built. And in 41 to 49, during the war and after, they built the flying wing on the left, but those were all canceled by the government and scrapped in 1953. But then in 1989, Jack Northrop got to see his B-2 fly. So during that time that Northrop was doing all those planes there at Moreland, there were air races at Mines. Well, now it's called not Mines Field anymore. It's called Los Angeles Municipal Airport. And so there were air races there in 1933, and there were air races there in 1936. So this is all out by that hangar number 1 area across from Moreland on Imperial. And this is what air races looked like back in the day.
Looking up at the sky, Harold Lloyd takes his glasses off.
Something
Norfolk's
happened
picturesque
there.
little town with its cross and village.
Sorry about that. Let's start again.
Norfolk's
Well, something weird's going on. This should be the air races. Here we go.
The U.S. national air races are on. While the crowds wait for the leaders to come in sight, the daredevils put up the sort of show that amuses Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Fairbank. When it comes to looking up at the sky, Harold Lloyd takes his glasses off. Skimming the ground with one wheel means handling the machine with a capital H. And here's an airman's version of picking up the handkerchief. But the the big stunt is the jump from a motorcycle onto a glider at speed. Watch him hang onto the wing. Nice for him, but it doesn't look too good for the motorcycle. And then all eyes are on the sky as the air race finalists roar past the pilots at over 4 miles a minute, led by the French ace, Detoya. And now watch an amazing picture of a crash. He's over. Over, but not badly hurt. The first airliner to inaugurate the new treated is a well-known figure, taken off from here that they run out of petrol. This time they're forced down in Newfoundland. They haven't quite kept...
Let's see if I can get out of here. Okay. Yeah, so,
Looks like we're getting to just one wing now.
kinda, yeah. Yeah, for the most part, I'd say the biplanes were kind of the past, yeah. Just whether they were on top or on the bottom. So there was a company in El Segundo called Interstate Aircraft and Engineering. It had its factory on Imperial next to Northrop Douglas, the Moreland building. And it designed and built 574 of these little cadet trainers there. But in 1942, it also designed a secret torpedo drone remote, a TDR. It was the world's first assault drone. So this was an unmanned drone, okay? They were built in DeKalb. They were designed here in El Segundo, but they were built in Illinois using Schwinn bicycle tubing, and Wurlitzer, Oregon provided the wood assemblies for them. They were made out of wood. And there was a camera in there, and the camera would transmit what it was seeing as it was flying, and then someone in an airplane behind it could control the drone, or someone on the ground could control the drone. And they were used in 1944 to bomb Japanese targets in the South Pacific. So that's the drone there on the right, and that's the interstate factory of Imperial. This is footage from test flying them down in the South Pacific on some island. I'm not sure which island it was. But they were the real deal, and they carried bombs. There's one, that number 2 lost its nose landing gear. There's another one taken off. But they kind of came into play towards the end of World War II, and they never really went past that. I don't know why it's not letting me get out of here. Okay, so now we'll talk about Donald Willis Douglas Sr. He had watched Orville Wright demonstrate the Wright Flyer for the U.S. Army, graduated from MIT. He worked at Connecticut Aircraft on a Navy dirigible. In 1915, he helped design the Glenn Martin hydroaeroplane, and then he went with Glenn Martin to Cleveland. And then in 1921, he started his own company, Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, which is a huge employer for Santa Monica, at Santa Monica Airport. And that's where the world cruisers were made that did the first round of world flight. And that's where the DC aircraft started, DC-1, DC-2, DC-3s, over 16,000 were built. Mainly in Long Beach and also in Oklahoma City and some foreign manufacturing of DC-3s. But in El Segundo in 1936, there was a design team headed by Donald Douglas, Jack Northrop, and Ed Heinemann, and they designed this airplane called the A-20 Havoc. And about 7,500 were built. Only about 100 in El Segundo. but most were built at Douglas, Santa Monica. And they were used in World War II by the Soviet Union, bought about almost half of them. And then England bought a lot, and France bought them. And then back to the Northrop design, for the original design of the Douglas Dulles dive bomber started with the Northrop design, and this was called the Scout Bomber Douglas, but its nickname was that it was slow but deadly. 5937 were built, most by Douglas El Segundo. So when I say Douglas El Segundo, that's Aviation and Imperial, where Northrop has that facility on the west side that runs from Imperial down to El Segundo Boulevard. That was where this plane was built, the Douglas dive bomber. And they had 700 employees working there in 1939, but that increased to almost 22,000 during the war years. So the Battle of Midway was a famous battle in the South Pacific, and SBD pilots destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and 2 heavy cruisers in that battle. And that turned the momentum of the war against Japan. They could never recover after that battle. But those are Douglas dive bombers going straight down onto the deck of those ships and bombing them. El Segundo made. That's what the factory looked like when they were cranking out 12 a day. Now we'll move on to this guy, James Dutch Kindleberger. He was with Glenn Martin, helped design their bomber. In 1921, the MB-2 was the first sinking of a battleship by air, was with this MB-2 bomber in 1921. So everything was just starting out back then in 1921. And in 1925, he worked for Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica as a chief engineer, and he worked on all these little 50 variants of this observation and mail plane. There was about 936 of these planes built, and he was the chief engineer on them from 1925 to 1930. And then he was also responsible for the design of the DC-1, 2, and 3 aircraft that were built. And then in 1934, Dutch Kindleberger became the North American Aviation president and general manager. And they built these trainers at LA Airport, kind of near hangar number 1. I'll show you a map in a little bit. And then there was another plane they built from 1935 to 52 called the Texan, and they were built mostly in Dallas, but some at LA Airport also. And then from 1940 to 44, they built a plane called the B-25 Mitchell Bomber. So 16 of those were built. It was the third largest bomber production ever. About 3,200 were built at LA Airport, and about 6,600 in Kansas City. So the reason they built in different places was you didn't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You know, we're at war. If the Japanese attacked the West Coast, you had to have your production spread out. The B-25 was operated in over 24 countries in every theater of World War II. And in April of 42, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle did his raid. 16 B-25s took off from the USS Hornet, and they attacked 5 cities in Japan. So there's the production there, the production over there by the airport, on the airport. There they are stacked up on the aircraft carrier, getting ready to take off to attack Japan. And let's see if we can do this. So this is what it looked like to take off in a so I got some internet problem.
Plans are changed on an hour's notice. Motors begin to warm up. Never before have big loaded bombers been launched in such numbers from a carrier at sea. For months they've trained secretly. Now for the test. Doolittle's plane is first down the runway, the commander leading the flight. As the carrier plows through heavy seas, one bomber after another soars from the flight deck, pointed for Japan. The sea grows rougher, the weather worse, but not one plane fails to get into the air. Taking the gale in its teeth, each bomber sets its course for carefully prearranged military objectives in Japan. A course that will put them over Tokyo at high noon in broad daylight.
So that's pretty impressive. So 6 weeks after the Doolittle raid, you know, like I think there were 80 airmen that flew on the raid, and 64 survived after they landed in China,
Yeah.
and Japanese occupied China too. Some of them ended up in Japanese occupied China. Some of them were killed by the Japanese. But 6 weeks later, Doolittle came to North American Aviation to thank the workers. And so that's Sim standing there, and that's over at LA Airport near that hangar number 1 where they had their factory. And there's all the workers out there to hear him thank them. So North American Aviation also built a famous airplane over at the airport called the P-51 Mustang. There was almost 11,000 built at LA Airport, and some down in Dallas, about 5,000 down in Dallas. In World War II, they escorted US bombers. They crippled the German Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe, when they saw this plane, they knew it was over. They destroyed almost 5,000 enemy aircraft during World War II, most of any other aircraft in the war. And almost half of all the kills in the European theater. And it was the most favored aircraft of the highly decorated Tuskegee Airmen. So here's now what we've grown into. There's hangar number 1 with the runways in front of it. That's Imperial Highway. Aviation's to the right there, and then North American Aviation is at this corner here. That's parking for North American Aviation. So this is where they built the Mustangs and the B-25 bombers. This is the little Moreland building that was across from hangar number 1. That's where the Northrop had his facility, and Douglas built their SDDs there. And then out here on Imperial, which is where Douglas is now, you had the Pickwick Night Coach, which also Interstate Engineering was out here, and Northrop and Douglas is out here. So that's what it looked like at the end of, kind of the end of World War II. So then what happened? Well, you can see here that the USA and Blue didn't have much aircraft manufacturing activity in World War I, but we had a huge output during World War II in Blue there. And then in post-war, we pretty much have dominated aircraft manufacturing since World War II for both airliners and military. You know, you had Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, a lot of airplanes are built. There was a pickup during the Vietnam and the Cold War period. And our local aerospace evolution and growth in the 40s, Southern California produced 60% of America's aircraft It was used in World War II. And you've heard of Rosie the Riveter. You know, when you needed to build that many planes, it didn't matter what race, religion, or color you were. They wanted you on the production line cranking out airplanes. And that legacy kind of stayed with anybody that's been in aerospace around here knows that all these workforces are very diversified around here. So it kind of broke the color barrier, you know, by just necessity. And then, you know, here we are in the 1950s, and you think back at those rickety planes that were just 40 years earlier, and now look what they're cranking out. You know, these jets, military jets, the X-15 breaking all sorts of records. And we're involved with it. These are locally designed and built aircraft. And then in the 60s and 70s, you know, Northrop has great success with an F-5 T-38 aircraft. They're starting to make missiles. This one, the upper right's my favorite. They only made 3 of them, but they were, or 2 of them. They were the XB-70. It was a Mach 3.2 6-engine aircraft bomber. And then North American Aviation got into the space program. They made the crew space module that went up on the Apollo aircraft. And Hughes, in this period, made their first satellite. It was the first geosynchronous satellite in the world. It was made by Hughes here at El Segundo. And then, you know, in the 80s, if anybody lived here during the 80s, you knew how many jobs there were in aerospace. I mean, the LA Times on a Sunday would be this, the classifieds would be this thick, and they were competing for employment, you know, and people could swap around, and, you know, it was a boom town, you know, during the 80s. Reaganomics, you know, it hurt other parts of the country, but we boomed here during the 80s. And then in '89, the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended, and in the 90s, there was a lot of downturn and consolidation of aerospace. And now in the 2000s, we've moved into satellites and space. So Aerospace Corporation over there on El Segundo Boulevard, that got established in 1960. In 1994, Northrop Grumman was formed from Northrop Corporation, and TRW got absorbed into Northrop Grumman. Lockheed Martin, the Loghead brothers and Glenn Martin are now a company. That was a consolidation of those two. Boeing, they absorbed North American Aviation, which was North American Aviation, Rockwell International. They got absorbed. Douglas Aircraft got absorbed by Boeing. Vultee, another, not local aerospace, but they got absorbed by Boeing. And then Hughes Space and Com, the early satellite group, they got absorbed by Boeing. And then Raytheon Technologies, they absorbed the Hughes aircraft side of the business. And then later on in 2005, 20 years ago, we started SpaceX. So that's how we've kind of grown. And I did this chart to kind of show how the evolution started with Lockheed Martin at the top. And so on the left side, you had Jack Northrop as a fallout from Lockheed. He had worked at Lockheed. And then TRW came along, and they formed Northrop Grumman. And then Hughes became part of Raytheon. And then if you go to the Martin side, Donald Douglas worked for Martin, and then he started Douglas Aircraft. Dutch Kindleberger left Douglas Aircraft and formed North American Aviation, and then those two got absorbed by Boeing along with Hughes Space and Com. And then the two big ones at the top, they're their own entity at the bottom, Lockheed Martin.
Oh, funny.
So that's our legacy.
Wow.
You know, it's pretty impressive to me that how much started here. And now, you know, this is an eye chart, you can't read this, but these are maps showing the concentration of what's now called deep tech or hard tech. These are all these little startup companies, ones that are starting to occupy or have been occupying the Smoky Hollow area and other parts of El Segundo, east of Sepulveda. You have all these little startup companies. So we still have, El Segundo I mean, Southern California still has the largest concentration of aerospace companies, but El Segundo, unto its own, is the biggest of any other city around. So that's the end. That was an hour.
Great, fantastic.
We want to thank you so much. That was enlightening and entertaining, and you
Yeah.
can tell how much work you put into it to study. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you can't pick up a book and read this history. This is very El Segundo centric. But it proves itself. I mean, it's all valid. Any questions?
I had a question, just as a reference. When did the Wright brothers get their first airplane up?
So they started in 1903.
03, because you were talking about 1910, so
Yeah,
it was
so what happened?
about 7 years.
So the Wright brothers, I don't like them. Here we were, this nascent industry or nascent science, and they held patents. And so they didn't want anyone else building aircraft that didn't honor their patents, even though their patents were very broad and not really applied. But then people like Glenn Curtiss did his own thing, and eventually those patents, the US government, because of World War I, eventually the US government said the Wright brothers' patents weren't going to be used to thwart aviation development. But the first, like 7 years, it was difficult for people to try and get into aviation because the Wright brothers were always throwing lawsuits at people. Any other questions? Yeah.
Probably a silly question. Who made the constellations?
That was Lockheed Constellation, and Howard Hughes ordered them from Lockheed, and before World War II started, and a bunch were built, and then they had already been painted in TWA colors because Howard Hughes owned TWA Airlines, and then the war started, and the government conscripted them to fly generals and admirals around the planet, and they told Howard to paint them in government colors, and he said, "You can take them, but I'm not painting them." And it was like the best. It was the best plane at the time. He was a racer. He had been a racer. He knew about aircraft design, so he worked with Lockheed to build this super fast, high altitude, pressurized cabin, and then the government took them. And then after the war, they gave them back used. but he was already in competition with other designs that were starting to get faster. It was still a very good plane for a number of years, but he would have been much better if the war hadn't started for him and everybody else. Yeah.
I have one thing, when you first started Martin,
Glenn
his
Martin?
father, right, when, in 1911, it said that he attempted to build an automobile called the Maxwell.
No, he was selling Maxwells.
Oh, he was selling them.
Yeah.
Okay.
His dad had a Maxwell dealership. Yeah.
Okay.
He set up a Maxwell dealership in Santa Ana.
Ah,
And then Glenn Martin got the aviation bug.
yeah.
And he actually built his plane inside a church in Santa Ana. An old church.
Maxwell.
Huh?
The reason I brought up the Maxwell, in 1912, when my father was born, the doctor that delivered him, this was back in Connecticut, drove a Maxwell.
Yeah.
And my grandmother liked that name so much that she gave him a middle name of Maxwell.
Oh, really?
And of course, my parents, of course, the tradition years ago was to carry on the family name.
Yeah.
So I've got a middle name, Maxwell. That was great that you got that there.
Anyone else? Was it too much?
No, amazing.
Very good.
I just wanted to show the evolution, and how it was so interconnected to even today's time.
Good job.
Yeah.
Tell us about the museum in Hermosa Beach.
Well, it was, I joined there in like 2003. The centennial for Hermosa Beach was 1907. And so when I joined the Historical Society there, the goal was to get a museum opened for the centennial. So we got space in the old Pier Avenue School on Pier and PCH. We have about 3,500 square feet there. We took over the old wood shop and some of the old locker rooms, and we converted them into a museum. So we have Hermosa Beach history, and we have an area for temporary rotating exhibits that we do 3 to 4 times a year. And then we have kind of a beach culture room that has all surfboards and skateboards and volleyball stuff. And then there's another area that talks about different music down there, like the Lighthouse Jazz and punk rock scene that started in Hermosa. So that's kind of what it is. And now we're trying to expand more and get more area. And we're also, this week we just had 2 people come out to the museum and meet with us for 2 days, because we're doing what's called an accreditation. We're going to become an accredited museum, which will open up more money for grants and research and things like that, and archiving. So it's a great museum if you haven't been in it. We do a lot of events there.
You're still in El Segundo.
We used to say, work in El Segundo, party in Hermosa, live in Manhattan Beach. That's my life.
There you go.
It's all South Bay.
The facility in Hermosa Beach, is that where the Performing Arts Center was
Yes.
at one time?
Yeah, we're down in kind of the bottom southwest corner of this. Yeah. So did anybody hear anything that they hadn't heard before about the company they worked for, or? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
I have to plug the history room.
Yeah,
Because many of you, if you haven't been here, we have
All
a
right.
history room right upstairs, and we are really in need of volunteers, because it can only be open when we have volunteers to staff it. So if you have never been there, I'm gonna be there tomorrow morning. You're welcome to come and look at it.
What time?
And I'll be there from 10 to 12, and then back again at 1. But we really need volunteers, and we had an open house in June. We had a lot of donations, so we're gonna have some special projects. So, and we have this meeting the first Thursday of every month, so please come back. And we're digitalizing all of our pictures, or trying to. It's an effort. So, there, the agenda's done. And if you haven't signed in, please sign in. If you leave your email, you'll be on our contact list, so I'll send you updates.